Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for joining us today in our workshop series. We will have today another very interesting presentation. In this case, Vitor Stegemann Dieter will be in charge of it. Vitor has done his PhD at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom, and now he's working as monitoring coordinator in the National Council of Justice in Brazil, um, doing activities in relation to monitoring the enforcement of Inter-American Court of Human Rights decisions related to prisons in Brazil. Vitor has done a very, very interesting ethnographic research on prison life and power relations inside prisons in southern Brazil, particularly in the state of Paraná. So he will present today on prison co-governance in a Brazilian prison, the role of prison gangs in counter-hegemony, that in some ways connected with his book that will appear next month. So we have like a first introduction to the book that will appear next month in Portuguese. The title of the book is Prison and Counter-Hegemony, the PCC and prison life in Brazil. So, Vitor, many, many thanks for accepting to participate in our workshop series. The floor is yours. You have 30 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm fully honored to be in this panels that are happening with the what Máximo, Richard, and all the committee has managed to accomplish. Of actually researching prison governance and imprisonment, which, as it used to be said, that there was a lack of ethnography in prison, and now we believe it's the opposite, right? We are perhaps in the best moment to research prison, and I think there's both parallels in the global south and global north, that we see this new research coming everywhere, and definitely making the field much more interesting. And so today I will be discussing fundamentally what is my book, and the focus is basically the book. But due to the limits of time, I will try to explore a little bit more the aspect that I think could ensue an interesting debate, especially since here we are with several of us who research prisons, both in the global south and north, and perhaps then we can explore further the aspects of discussion. I will share a brief PowerPoint. The goal of it is not to follow it strictly, but just to have something that you could use as a means of following the logic of what I intend to be the main argument of the book coming. It's working properly now. Right, so the main goal here is to present some of the aspects of the book and why it's written as such, and then sort of a pinpoint what are the contributions, I think, to the field that we could discuss together and reflect upon. And basically, the goal is to go through this. And it does sound a lot, so I'll try to break it into simple, more digestible parts. And I do think there's a logic to it, which starts from the typical discussion from the general problems that I saw in the literature, and then what could be explored from that, beyond that, and then the method that I used, following from the empirical research, and then the main contributions of what is the book trying to say, right? And so then we have to start with the obvious part, which is this is a book which started as only a research about a prison gang known as the PCC. And then I will explore that briefly later. But the issue is that it started as a research on a particular gang. And as my field research developed, what happened is that I gained full access to a couple of maximum security prisons. And then I started to find the relations of how actually gangs and prison collectives actually operate with prison staff. And therefore, there's a crossover of two topics that in the literature are quite separate, which is the debate on gangs and the PCC in particular, which is a particular prison gang from Brazil. And on the other hand, the debate on prison and prison governance. The goal here is not to separate those two, but the literature, it is a separate literature. And I do believe that we must, in my particular case, we must join those two and discuss them together as we develop further. And when we explore the literature of gangs, it is clear, at least to me, was clear that there was a couple new developments that we could explore better, and they were pointing towards a new understanding or a new approach to gangs, right? The dominant trope to gangs is the antisocial adaptation of gangs, right? Everyone knows this. It comes from the United States. That's the protocol, their way of dealing with it. And overall, it does deal with this. The UK also has this kind of behavior. A lot of Europe actually responds to gangs, a lot of these aspects of antisocial behavior and the youth gangs that respond to that. But there's a recent trope that I don't quite agree, but it's quite popular ultimately, which is the economic model or self-governance, right? This model of economic model has been, I mean, I would say the most important proposal of it comes from David Skarbek in his book on prison gangs in California. He further made other developments on discussions of prisons. I believe that his strongest argument, which I'm not convinced, come from his main book on prison gangs in California. And basically, what they try to argue is that there's an economic motivation underlying rational choice theory, of course, that basically makes this prison gangs a sort of, especially when prison is a core space where criminals must go through, right, in their criminal lives. And they create this governance to other inmates. And through gangs, they manage to actually exchange goods, of course, illicit goods. They manage to control areas and protect other fellow criminals. And therefore, they assume this function that we would say would be from the state, but due to its illegality, it becomes a trope of this prison gang. And this has developed in this sort of a self-governance idea in which there's no state, but the gangs themselves are governing the criminal market. And that also follows some other important references here. I would say mainly Benjamin Lessing from University of Chicago, who usually argues that the bigger the prison is, the more prisoners you have, the more you have self-governance due to the number of individuals inside ruling self-governance. And I'm not quite satisfied with that, and we can explore why in the empirical findings. But one of the main issues that we can find in the literature itself is that the economic rationality model does explain economic motivation. But when it goes further and discusses actually the politics of governance, it's quite limited in its proposal. And instead, of course, there's the cultural criminologist response, right? And the cultural criminology response, especially in the UK, has been quite rich. And Simon Halsworth, for instance, has an interesting argument here, which also other important theories in the US, which would say, well, this is a label, it's a complicated label, you can't apply gangs quite properly to these individuals, it doesn't work quite well that way, and actually we would better understand these groups as sort of coming and going, disappearing, and better in their own terms. I think we could develop that further. I do think that when we talk about the PCC, which is a bigger organization, not a couple of youth gangs in the UK or in the US, we must discuss also the political stances of those groups. And political here, I don't mean with a capital P. I mean with a political in the sense of a typical Gramscian perspective, which would say politics is what we do to govern our lives in terms of norms and legislation, which is not statecraft, but it's also social craft. And therefore, if we explore this political aspect, we can gain more from understanding this cultural approach. And so I argue that there are interesting developments in this way. They don't quite classify themselves as political cultural perspective, but I do think that some references could be fit into that label, which I seek to explore further. Of course, that basically turns me into the discussion of prison, right? And the problem with prison is we have a debate on the production of prison order, and most of the production until very recently has been from Western affluent countries. That is not to say that there hasn't been before very recently developments and research in the global south on the production of prison order. But it is to say that these places in the global south frequently use those frameworks to add a comma and just add something else to it instead of using its own reference to understand what we could explore from own prison reality in the global south. Of course, I don't find this satisfying, and mainly here, this has been repeated by many. I think one of the greatest problems of this and the greatest example of limitations of this aspect is Louis Kant and his perspective of explaining containment as a general framework of reference that works very poorly in Europe, and I would say not adequately at all in Latin America. But there is something in the global north which is quite useful, which is the framework of power. Prison power is quite an important aspect that we could further develop if we're willing to understand the politics of everyday governance from prison gangs. And so that we should rescue that and understand that in tandem with the new research that is coming from the global south. And in regards to the global southern prison governance discussion, what I add is that what we have here is a rich literature of contextualized experiences. I do believe this is a new framework of discussion. And I do think that great frameworks have been developed from this. But I am not currently fully satisfied with the, let's call it hard theory aspects that have been developed so far. And not that there is an interesting aspect to this, but I do think that we can add something more to that and have this deeper understanding of this power relations within prison, overall prison inmates, prison collectives, and the prison staff with the penal apparatus. So that is a question then that leads us to this aspect of right. But what do we have to explore in terms of power? And in terms of power, of course, in criminology, we have the public choice, which is a very poor understanding of power, is basically power as economic motivation, quite limited in understanding the durations of power. But there are also interesting critical liberal perspectives, right? Which would, in a Weberian sense, would understand power, for instance, as an institutionalized means of producing norms and regulating life through the perception of justice of individuals. So that's something that we could explore further, but I do think that a more radical perspective could help. And I explore other radical perspectives, especially Fusterian perspectives. Structurally, my perspective is quite interesting in that regard. But I believe, again, that what has been developed so far, for instance, from Althusser, let's say from Stuart Hall, limits the understanding of prison governance within a penal apparatus, because we're talking about whole society, class society, race, and sometimes we have to pin it down to a single institution and how that applies to the everyday governance. So I do think also that there's a limit here in which structurally Marxist perspective, and this is, we would say, a tradition from sociology, right? That also links to the other framework there of a Foucauldian perspective, which usually is quite pessimistic of the possibilities of change, right? It's usually, well, the administration has the power, it orders how people live, and people are basically, in German, the Trägers of structures, right? So they're carrying structures and they're just reproducing the system. Paul Willis, in terms of gangs, is a typical reference here, which is a quite interesting framework, but basically just puts gangs as a simple reproduction of large frameworks of exclusion and working class life. And I would say maybe we can develop even further from critical alternatives. Deleuze and Guattari here are interesting frameworks, but I don't think their solution is quite satisfying because they remove the idea of one thing is the state and the debate, the other thing is civil society, and they separate those two. I think we can put them together. For that, Gramscian perspective is quite useful, and I'll call this a critical radical take, which would mesh and combine the idea of praxis, that people build their own lives according to the structures that they enter in, but they don't just reproduce it. They try to create their own lives from that. And also the idea of hegemony. Hegemony is this structure which comprises and creates the structures that we live from these compositions of classes, social groups, state apparatus, etc., etc. And this state apparatus actually acts within civil society. The interesting point of hegemony here, and this is an important part that we'll return later, is that if praxis says that everything can have an aspect of struggle, the question is, hegemony also says that the structures that we live in, this apparatus that we live in, are not solely based on coercion, but also on consent. And the question is, can we understand prison governance from the aspect of consent as well, or must we reduce it to coercion as typical critical perspectives such as a Foucauldian perspective typically adopts? And in order to actually undertake the research, my hypothesis was two-step one. The first one, that we should add power here, this rich tradition from the global north. And in the second step is that we should develop it further, right? So to understand how hegemony shapes and can be reshaped from the struggles from below and actually change the whole prison system. The question is it useful to understand the vantage point of struggles for hegemony and counter-hegemony in a prison setting within the discussion of prison game? The methods of research are I would say, typical, but with aspects of triangulation. So I suggest an ethnography, right, against the detached engagement with the subjects. And I do undertake an ethnography of approximately 9 months, just following a maximum security prison in which I could observe the everyday lives of prison guards with prisoners and prison gangs, how the security issues were being dealt, how prisoners were actually discussing their everyday life challenges with the administration, with other prison guards. And that was quite useful. But in order to actually fully explore the problem of ethnography in a prison that we all know, it's quite opaque, right? It's an institution in which silence speaks a lot, but silence also doesn't tell you the nuances of what's going on. I was actually doing field work of ethnography in the streets with prison gangs who had contact within the prison, and was constantly seeing their report in relation with prisoners, how the criminal life in the streets were actually shaping everyday life in prison, and understanding the perspective of a prison gang in tandem with the prison itself, with the prison governance of prison. Also, I interviewed separately, as not only as a participant observation method, I interviewed approximately 50, I have to recall the numbers exactly currently, but approximately 50 something participants. The interviews were around an hour and a half. There were prison guards, there were state officials, there were also ex-convicts, also convicts, and human rights organizations. What else? So, and here my argument was that I also collected data from the fields, which is quite interesting. I had a lot of data, which sometimes in ethnography they call this the artifices, right? The products constructed when you're away and you just analyze it as such. I developed methodology to understand a couple of those methods sent through WhatsApp and the production of illegal goods in prison and so forth and so forth. But the main point here is that the Gramscian view was quite helpful in allowing me to develop this method, because the Gramscian view argues that you should start from below and understand the practice from people going from below. And then in those relations, you can scale up in relation to the power structure that build consent into individuals in prison. And overall, I did, besides one prison, which I spent around 9 months, I also went into and interviewed prisoners in other 4 prisons, and visited several prison guards and in the streets to corroborate the information. Well, and then we start with the main findings, and I'll be very brief because I think this is also a way to portray and recommend the reading of the book, because I think here's the jewel, and I can convince you that this will be worthy. But the main findings are divided in 4 chapters in the book, And these findings in these 4 chapters, they are divided. The first 2 chapters are focused on the prison gang, and the second last chapters are focused on the prison order, the prison governance itself. Of course, they intertwine quite a lot, but they can be separated in terms of relation. Chapter 6 and 7, for instance, in chapter 6, we discuss how inmates saw a change in their life when this new prison gang started to suggest that there was a need to change the way they behaved in the everyday life. Instead of disciplining other prisoners through violence, they started to create norms to regulate their everyday life, which actually changed dramatically the way they view their own lives and changed dramatically the aspects of violence, reduced violence to significant aspects in prisons and outside. Of course, I can talk about what the ethnographer, the interviewer, he told me, but also the data shows this quite interesting in a huge space as the research was undertaken. But the main aspect here is that this is a change of behavior from one mode of prison gang behavior, which was quite exploitative, to another form of prison behavior, which was seeking also, still being quite criminal and seeking to sell drugs, commit homicide with opponents and so forth. Among those that were in prison, they created this collectivity of solidarity, which is quite important. And that also meant that they created this dialogue in which they constructed to themselves and to the outside, the authorities as the enemy. So they created an enemy that could be clearly pointed out, and all the frustrations could be pointed out to the prison apparatus and sometimes even prison officers as a whole. And a key aspect here of the ethnography is the idea of the ethics of the crime. The idea that there should be an ethics when you are a criminal and behave as a criminal. There's an ethics that you should follow. And then in chapter 7, we speak about how they don't at all changing these norms. They don't at all abandon their economic interests, but they develop their economic interests as actually something else when they organize as such, right? So the fact that they're always looking in the ethnographic expression here is the progress. They're always looking for progress, right? They're always looking to a way to build up, become wealthier. But in everyday life, among what they themselves call, right, them the criminals, they say that there's importance in the discipline to themselves. And this discipline means, first and foremost, not coercion, but raising awareness that we are sort of equivalent people suffering from the same oppression, and there's a whole other enemy here. That's an important aspect because the discipline is quite controlled among them, and they're constantly discussing this in their cells every day. They're discussing how it works, how should it work, who has done what. You can imagine in a prison cell that is 4 by 4 meters, you have 20 inmates discussing their everyday lives at all times, how this actually creates a sort of a new behavior among them. And the important part here, I would say, especially in regard to the PCC, that is a finding that has not been found in other research about the PCC, this large prison gangs from Brazil, is that the PCC constantly added new aspects to its, they call it the ideology, which is to become in Portuguese a união, right? We can translate it as a union in English. It's not a union in the sense of a labor union, but it's definitely a conglomerate that defends itself and they see themselves as a collective. And then chapter 8 and 9, which are more focused on how this full organization of inmates with the PCC works with the penal administration. In chapter 8, of course, I start to explore the limits and the difficulties of everyday life of prison guards, how penal administration management actually have in the scarcity strains that they feel in their everyday life, how they actually have to explore alternatives to produce prison order, right, without the proper means of creating prison order, because a lot of rehabilitation methods are lacking. So how do you push prisoners to agree with the whole prison system? And the problem is that this is a crisis, especially the global south lives, and that prison officers constantly, and especially the prison director or the correctional officer in the administration, have to navigate constantly and try to create a balance with inmates, despite the lack of staff, lack of conditions. And so this is a reality that they must navigate, and they navigate it partly by creating a dialogue, we'll explore it in chapter 9, but also by trying to create means of surveillance and putting their own volition, their own efforts into creating another space of consent with prisoners. And finally, chapter 9, and here is, I think, the greatest contribution, perhaps, of the research, which is the finding of how everyday life prison guards and the security officers, how they try to build a governance with inmates. And then I found in this prison in itself that it lived through a change, a dramatic change, in which this unit used to be being a maximum security unit, in which prisoners stay mostly in their own cells confined, of course, in overcrowding conditions, most of them, not all. How can you build them to actually not rebel, right? And this is a dramatic change that this prison unit went from total confinement and then a quite intense struggle from prisoners to change the conditions of their life, rebelling, hunger strikes, destroying the prison apparatus, using fellow criminals in the streets to threat prison officers in the streets. And they managed to change that tight conditions of confinement to one that is still quite controlled, but now they have some aspects of negotiation and dialogue directly with the security to improve their daily life. For instance, a simple aspect of it is their food. How can they govern and discuss and change and adapt their menu, for instance, that they have to eat every week? Or if they need to paint the pitch, actually to play something, how can they actually bring the products to change the structures of prison itself in those regards? This still means that prison guards quite have control of what they're doing, when they're moving, but it does mean that they now have an aspect of influence within the prison staff. And this change is not only something that happened due to the resistance of prisoners, but this is also something that changed in the attitudes of prison guards. Prison guards that were not willing to dialogue with prisoners in general, in a change of administration that was trying to balance out this complete crisis that was going on in the prison, they were still in prison, but they were left out of the security team, which was more able to dialogue for everyday life changes inside the prison unit. And so I call this sort of a shared governance that was based on this dialogue among them. And then moving forward with how this speaks to the dialogue with Gramsci that I was saying was quite important, right? So the first thing that is quite relevant here is that I found that the PCC expresses itself as a typical Gramscian party, right? And what do we mean with a party? We don't mean the legislative aspect of the Communist Party, right? Or we don't mean the Liberal Party in Italy. What we mean is the party is that group among inmates that develop an ideology, a vision of how life should be, and they move forward and put pressure for changes in their everyday life. And they develop a theory about it, even if it's everyday theory, right? But they develop this commonsensical theory that could create bonds among them. And this worked quite well to organize the whole mass of prisoners. Of course, there were exclusions in this process, but it created among the huge mass of prisoners in the state a discipline that not only the PCC believes, but convicts themselves actually abide, believing that this is better for everyday life. The second part here is that there is the aspect of the ethics of the crime, right? And the ethics of the crime, as I said, is a clear ideology of subalternity. So they realize that they are subaltern to the prison system. And this realization of being subaltern allows them to create some norms that position themselves as a group and also an ideology itself. And they call it an ideology, right? Their view, their perspective as such, even though they have no Gramscian reference here or a Marxist reference at all. I mean, we're talking about mostly uneducated prisoners who went through the system and being selected from the poorest slums in Brazil. Another important aspect in dialogue with Gramsci is that the prison does need hegemony. It does need to build consent among inmates. more than mere coercion. And the prison that I was researching in specific, but also the whole region, was quite exemplified this quite well, which is they tried to coerce them to a certain limit, but the resistance puts extreme pressures, and their lack of means to rehabilitate and bring inmates to the prison staff demanded that they change their sort of way of governing the prison unit. So there's a lot of consent here, but do not be mistaken. We're talking about Gramsci. Consent here is not this consent, which is a liberal way of saying, I agree with what you're saying because of out of my free will, this is the way I want to live. No, this is an aspect in which it's part of a struggle. Consent is always a tension. And there is this terminology that I use, which is called this tug of war, in which prisoners in that particular aspect are pushing towards one way and the prison staff are pushing another way. And sometimes they find that in the middle ground is where governance is actually happening. But this is a struggle through consent and to the consent of prisoners. And therefore, there is praxis there. There is change among not only the prisoners, but the prison administration that should be accounted in our research. And another aspect that was quite interesting in dialogue with Gramsci is that the struggles here can be unpacked as strategies of war of maneuver and war of position, right? A war of maneuver is that struggle in which they try to articulate the whole effort, the frontal attack to change the system. And riots, hunger strikes, the destruction of prison apparatus, their threat to prison staff, and also the mobilization of prison families, the demands to human rights groups, those are all strategies that they use to try to change conditions. And they're constantly trying to use those strategies. Sometimes they work as a war maneuver and they actually achieve a change of their position. And here, once they have a change of position, there's a war of position, a war within the governance of the system or not. But when there's a war of position, they're trying to adapt prison life to what they think could be more fit to their survival. And I believe that co-governance could be well seen as a form of war of position. Co-governance in itself could be always seen as a dynamic in which prisoners, through their consent and struggle, need to actually speak to guards and create a way of surviving in these interactions between both of them. And here, going to the end, I think there are interesting things here that we developed from Gramsci, not actually extracting what Gramsci said, but a little bit beyond him, right? So the thing is, the first use of Gramsci is not a typical use of Gramsci, as Stuart Hall, for instance, used it quite properly. It's more about thinking with Gramsci than actually applying Gramsci in its literal self. But I do think that there are tools there that allow us to think the prison apparatus and the prison administration with its subaltern subjects within. Also, the fact that the prison notebooks are quite open and there are a lot to gain on that theoretical field. And that Gramsci so far has been not a theory of particular gangs or prisons, and I do think it's an aspect there. In here, finally, to pinpoint the last aspect of the slide is that compared to other approaches who have sought to compare power relations between PCC and prison authorities, I believe that Gramscian approach, in terms of methods, in terms of the theoretical contribution, offered a richer perspective, putting power back into discussion of co-governance in the research as a whole. And to finish it off, upon reflections on research and theory, right? The method of ethnography was quite tense. It was not easy to collect data with prison gangs and gangs in the street, as well as with correctional officers in prison. And sometimes it did felt as doing research time. This is a fact that I was waiting for hours, complicated things that we have to navigate as fellow researchers. We all have been through this, right? The challenges of actually getting the reality back into the paper was quite intense. From staff, the problem that I had to deal with was the internal arrangements of power, which were quite unstable. Sometimes a prison guard could become a prison inspector, a security officer. So there's struggles among them. And also the concern that things going on inside could extrapolate to the outside. So that was quite limiting, especially within prison. That was why it was so important to interview them in the streets as well, especially through contexts that allow me to snowball. The second aspect is from prisoners, right? The problem with the distancing that a person who's seen as an agent that's closer to the staff might be limited to take from them in an interview inside prison. And also the apprehension of sharing, right? I mean, we all know what happens when someone is seen as a snitch, especially in those tight spaces of maximum security prisons, in which they all abide to a hardcore vision of what is the correct and right way to be a so-called criminal. I do think that triangulations in the streets were quite useful, but we all know the inevitable bias of snowballing. And I had to go through my gatekeepers, which allow me to have more access, but of course, of a particular kind of access. I do think that there are social and professional life aspects of mine that were in contrast to the marginalized participants, but my personal relation to many of them, which I managed to build in the time that I was in the streets following the research after prison, try to break those tensions. And I do think that here there's also an important limit that we should know, is that this is the focus of the PCC in prison. I did understand how the PCC and discuss the PCC, how it acts in the street, but the aspect of what I wanted to understand was how the prison, how their views of prison and their construction of order in prison work. So this is not a discussion of the PCC as a prison gang in the streets making money and or organizing themselves, but how this starts from the prison and goes outside of it. And of course, there were constraints of time and major security concerns that I had to navigate that are also quite limited. And sometimes, you know, we do know that an important aspect of reflexivity here. So the contribution here was the daily interactions of authorities with prisoners and the PCC firsthand. There are very few researchers that manage to see this happening in their daily lives within a prison unit. And I did have that opportunity in a maximum security prison. I do think that this is a novel contribution in the discussion of how the PCC works from a critical radical perspective that I have not seen in other aspects. I do think that there are contributions here on how we can think Gramsci to the inner dynamics of prison inmates among them, that relation prison and inmates to gang. I also think that there are interesting contributions of discussion in the criminal literature as a whole. For instance, the what is now consolidated notion of discipline, which is a Foucauldian notion, to what extent the conception of discipline as mere coercion, as Foucault usually brings forth, is enough to understand the idea of behaving a certain way. And I think there's an interesting critical Marxist perspective that thinks discipline in a much more broader way. For instance, this has been largely discussed in Marxist perspective on how labor unions, their discipline is quite important to actually revolt, right? And to what extent can we limit the idea of discipline only to a top-down perspective, which I think we should address as well in the criminological tradition. In my view, that has been quite stalled since the Foucauldian perspective. Also, the idea of the party, of gangs discussing their social lives, representing other individuals, being at the forefront of that discussion. The idea of a non-romanticized counter-hegemony. They are struggling against the prison apparatus, but not necessarily as an ideal of an emancipation. They're struggling for their everyday life, which can mean negative consequences for the life outside. And actually, I think another great contribution here is the idea of consent without excluding coercion, because consent in modern state apparatus must mean that there is this relationship that it requires coercion to always be there and guarantee the ultimate functioning of that hegemony. I do think that gang theory could gain a lot from exploring power beyond the cultural perspective, or even especially beyond economic perspectives, the economic methods. I do think that we need to build bridges between the Western tradition of thinking prisons and the predominant contemporary Southern singularization of prison dynamics, which is quite rich, but we can build those bridges for them, and there have been built, but I still think there's something that we can develop there as well, and I hope I can bring that also to the discussion. And finally, the problem of the democratizations of Brazilian prisons, because we're never outside of the discussion of what is a democracy and how a democracy, a capitalist democracy, fits into the means of disciplining people. and actually demanding that people have their voice, but also are structurally constrained to not having their voice in some apparatus of the modern capitalist civil society and society as a whole. So this is basically a presentation. I do see that I went a couple of minutes further. I do thank Sozzo and everyone else for their patience, and I'll close the presentation here. Thank you very much.